Welcome to the Real News Network, folks. I'm Mark Steiner. Good to have you with us once again. Yesterday, there were 4 primaries and 1 special election in the United States. We had primaries in Kansas, Missouri, Michigan, and Washington, with a special election in Ohio. And many folks thought that the progressive movement in this country could follow up on the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York City. But that didn't quite happen. But things did move forward. There were interesting elections that took place. We're going to analyze where that's going, what it means for the movement, what it means for the struggle within the Democratic Party, and what it might mean for the general election. With a man who I've interviewed many times over the years and a really great analyst, John Nichols, who is the National Affairs editor and correspondent for The Nation. And John, welcome. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, Mark.
And his latest book is Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, which actually fits into this conversation very neatly, I think.
It does. It fits into every conversation.
Unfortunately, you're right.
Yeah.
But let's dive into what happened in the elections yesterday. There were a number of progressive candidates backed by a brand new Congress, Justice Democrats, Our Revolution, a number of other groups, and very few of them actually won their primary battles. So I'm wondering how you would assess what happened and what these elections meant yesterday.
Sure. Well, let's begin with those races. And I'll tell you, flat out, having interviewed a lot of the brand new Congress, Justice Democrats folks, what they will tell you is that they're going into tough races. They aren't just doing what a lot of national groups do, which is, pick pretty secure, pretty safe races, pretty secure, pretty safe candidates. They're endorsing candidates who are running uphill races, sometimes against incumbents, as was the case with Cori Bush running against Lacy Clay out in Missouri, for instance. And those are not races that you're necessarily guaranteed to win. You fight them because you think they should be fought. You fight them because you may be laying down a marker for future races. And also one final thing that I think people lose sight of in this case, and this is not to make excuses. I mean, there were losses. There's no doubt of that. But you also fight them to turn people out because that may influence other races. So let's look at that Cori Bush race in St. Louis, in the St. Louis area, for instance. She got about 37% of the vote. That's pretty good for a challenger to a long-term incumbent. But here's what else happened in the St. Louis area. You had this high turnout, and you had the sitting prosecuting attorney who failed to take the lead, failed to do what was necessary after the Ferguson tragedy and killing of Michael Brown. And he was defeated by a 57-43 margin. A young lawyer named Wesley Bell won that race. You also in Missouri had a referendum on labor rights, a very important vote. And that referendum, the labor side won overwhelmingly. So one thing to put into the mix here is that when you're getting into, a particular race, yeah, of course, if you're an activist group, if you're an activist candidate, you want to win that race. But if you're serious about politics, you also want to turn people out and get energy up to win other races as well. So I think that's one perspective to bring to all of this.
I want to come back to the Missouri referendum in a moment, but I was thinking about your book, The Trumpocalypse, The Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, which I love that title.
And you pronounce it well, which I'm very impressed with.
One of the things you're also watching in these races is that in the Republican primaries, the candidates who have been backed, not all the time, but many of the candidates who have been backed by Donald Trump, who support Donald Trump, part of his kind of world inside the Republican Party, have been winning. And I wonder how you analyze these movements that are doing that inside the Republican Party. At the same time, what effect the progressive movement is having inside the Democratic Party, because it's also seeing that the more establishment, liberal, and moderate candidates and incumbents in the Democratic Party are calling themselves progressives and mouthing some progressive phrases. So, what do you think the dynamic here we're watching is?
Well, I think what you are pointing to is a reality that's very important to be aware of, and that is that both parties are in the process of radical change, and they aren't in that process of radical change simply because of movements. They aren't in that process of radical change simply because particular candidates have stepped up or particular, political movements have come into play. They're also changing because of the times we live in. We are 30 years into a globalization revolution. We're 20 years into a digital revolution. We're 10 years into an automation revolution. People are realizing that the politics of the past doesn't work anymore. Now, the Republican Party's answer to that, quite frankly, is to go further to the past, to make America great again, to blame immigrants, to blame refugees, to blame, just about anybody they can look at for why things aren't the way they were and why things aren't the way they want them to be. In the Democratic Party, you have a transition where a lot of progressives are coming in and saying, look, this Democratic Party as it currently exists, as it currently speaks to people, is not effective enough to excite young folks, to excite people who are worried about all these changes. You have to adjust your message. You have to, frankly, become a much more progressive party. And so I think that the times are forcing both parties to more clear positions. And the Republicans have clearly become a right-wing populist party. I think the Democrats will become much more of a left-wing populist party as time goes on.
And I wonder what the dynamic will mean in America. It sounds like, could we be seeing in some ways the splitting of these parties, like as the Whigs fell apart and the Republicans were created in the 1850s? I mean,
well, we've been waiting a long time for a new party, right? 1854 was a bit of a while ago. And
yep, a little
bit. The counsel I would give you is this. The political parties have gamed the system from top to bottom, with money, with gerrymandering, with a host of other political interventions and structural interventions that make it very, very hard for new parties to develop. This is a reality that we have to recognize. And when we recognize it, then you understand why so much of the energy goes into fights within the existing parties. Now, here's the interesting thing that happened. The hard right, in my opinion, and particularly the corporatist right, came in big to the Republican Party, and in many senses, they have transformed the Republican Party into something they want. I'm a critic of it. I'm not a fan of what it's become. I think it's abandoned the basic premises of what the Republican Party was founded to be. But it has changed. It has become the party of Trump. With the Democratic Party, it's a much grayer area, much more uncertain area. But ultimately, I do think the Democratic Party is going to be forced to become dramatically more progressive, even social democratic on a host of issues. And that may result in some of the corporatists and some of the money people trying to create a new centrist party or something, that sort of swims between the two. But I want to emphasize, I don't think that a new centrist party is going to develop out of the grassroots, out of the American people. My sense is that the changes that are occurring in our economy and in our society are likely over time to move people to the left. And I don't say that because that's where I'm at. I say, when you have a situation where traditional work is being radically changed, where jobs will not be as well defined, where people will be in the gig economy, less likely to get a traditional benefit package, a traditional pay package, there's going to be much more demand for Medicare for all, single-payer health care. There's going to be much more demand for free education. There's going to be much more demand for free and low-cost transportation. And so that isn't a left-right thing. It happens to end up that those are a lot of left-wing positions, but it's a practical reality. And so a centrist party that argues against that and says, oh, yeah, we're just going to maintain the status quo, people aren't happy with the status quo. I think that, obviously the Republicans are trying to pull them towards something in the past that cannot be recreated and frankly is very damaging. But the Democrats at this point haven't shown enough leadership to pull toward the future. And I don't think a centrist party would do that.
So let me take very quickly two aspects of yesterday's primaries and talk about what they may mean. We mentioned it briefly at the beginning of our conversation. The first thing is the vote in Missouri that stopped the right to work. That said we want right to work in Missouri, which actually confronts also the Janus decision the Supreme Court has handed down that really hurt public unions and unions in general. So this sets up a dynamic for the unions as well. So talk a bit about that vote and what you think that means.
I think the Missouri vote's the biggest vote of yesterday, the biggest deal of yesterday, because it's a structural vote. It's not merely about candidates or even movements, and obviously those votes are important. But a structural vote is one where the people are given a chance to actually weigh in on a major issue, how they define, in this case, a substantial portion of their economic life. And what you saw in Missouri was in a state where Donald Trump won, but so did Mitt Romney. In fact, Republicans have won the last 5 presidential elections in Missouri. You also have a state where the Republicans hold the governorship and control the legislature. This should be a conservative Republican traditional state. And yet they were given a chance to vote on whether they want strong unions, whether you want unions that can go up against corporations, that can fight in the workplace, but also in society for fairer wages, better benefits, some protection of public services, things of that nature. And amazingly, well, I don't think amazingly, but strikingly, 67% of people voted for strong unions.
Right.
It's a 2-to-1 margin. And, the same thing happened in Ohio a couple of years back. They had a vote on a union issue, and you had 62% of people voting for strong unions. Here's what I think is happening. I think working class people and middle class people are looking at the economic realities around them and saying, no, I don't want to give it all away to the corporations. Maybe these folks aren't all big liberals. Maybe they aren't all left wing on everything, but they know that over the top corporate power is bad for them, bad for their communities. And so, when people are given a chance to vote on whether they want strong unions or not, the interesting thing is they vote for them.
It's true. And I think that would be interesting to watch to see if the unions in America actually pick up on this and begin to see they have more power than I think they have, given all they've lost. So this would be an interesting dynamic to see how that unfolds over this election and beyond. And the other election that I found interesting, Rashida Tlaib won and probably guarantees her a seat in the U.S. Congress. She takes Conyer's seat, who's retired from the House, and she would become the first Muslim American woman to sit in the U.S. Congress, and was backed by brand new Congress and other progressive groups in this country. So that was an interesting victory.
It was a victory, and you see that's where look, I cover politics for a living, and I've never ever seen an election where everybody got everything they wanted,
right,
or one where nobody got anything they wanted. The fact is, elections, especially when you're in really this intense competition to define a political party, are going to give you a lot of results that are going to come from all over the place. The Rashida Tlaib victory in the Detroit area is, I think, a pretty remarkable one. That is the district John Conyers represented. It's been redistricted, gerrymandered, turned around, twisted over the years. So it's not, exactly what Conyers always represented, but it's, basically the district he had for, a good period of time. And it sent one of the most progressive people to Congress. He was forced to retire, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, right. And it was as a result of a Me Too controversy, and one that we should take seriously. But Conyers did serve in Congress as a very progressive member. And the question was, would that district, in a multi-candidate field, elect someone or nominate someone who would be as progressive, perhaps even more progressive in some ways than John Conyers? And they did. Rashida Tlaib has been a state legislator, a activist in the streets, protesting on behalf of worker rights, single-payer health care, but also immigrant rights, refugee rights. And her victory is a very big deal. When she will get to Congress, she will be, I think, a particularly significant member. And so that result is one that I've watched with, frankly, great interest.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot of variables to that, especially in the battles over Israel-Palestine, Middle East policy. There's a lot here, as well as issues for Medicare for all nationally. So there's things we have to really watch. And we'll be watching these and having more in-depth discussions in the coming weeks through these primaries and through the general election. We're facing some really important issues and a very important election coming up this year. And Real News will be there to cover all that we have to cover for all of us to understand what's going on, and are talking with people like John Nichols, the national affairs correspondent for Nation magazine, who knows a lot about our national politics and more. John Nichols, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
It is a tremendous pleasure to be with you, Mark. I'm glad you're doing this show.
Thank you. See you down the campaign trail. And folks, I'm Mark Steiner for the Real News Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back. Take care.